Louis Ticus lost the one thing that could not be replaced, safety for his family, when a force sworn to keep order chose to treat a living camp as disposable, and something was taken away while respectable people looked in another direction. Louis Ticus is the victim. On April 20th, 1914, at Ludlow, Colorado, the central act of injustice is direct. The tent colony of striking families was attacked, set on fire, and erased as a functioning community in a single day, with children among the dead. The beneficiary was not a lone gunman or a moment of chaos. It was institutional control returning to the company's orbit under the protection of the Colorado National Guard, operating alongside guards tied to the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. One piece of evidence remains fixed in the public record. The date itself, April 20th, 1914, followed immediately by deaths, national outrage, and headlines that turned a labor dispute into a moral wound. This film will show how that wound could be absorbed, managed, and eventually filed away without a lasting public scandal, and how John D. Rockefeller Jr. could exit with his name intact. Ludlow did not begin as an argument about wages. It began as a place where families tried to live through a strike. Canvas, stove smoke, wash lines, children moving between tents as if the future still belonged to them. In 1914, the American industrial order depended on two things that rarely appeared in the same photograph: power exercised in private and legitimacy performed in public. The public saw a nation modernizing, rail lines, steel, coal, capital moving faster than the people who extracted it. The private sphere, where decisions were written and signed, understood something colder. Reputations were assets, and scandal was a risk to be priced, contained, and redirected. The year matters because the country was already tense and politically awake. In the months leading into Ludlow, the progressive era had made corporate behavior a subject of national scrutiny, not just local resentment. The press had learned how to turn industrial conflict into a narrative the public could carry: names, photographs, testimony, the blunt arithmetic of casualties. And yet the same era also produced new tools for controlling what the public would remember: commissions, statements, dignified investigations, carefully framed responsibility that could be acknowledged without ever being owned. Ludlow sits inside that contradiction. On one side is the event that cannot be made respectable: a tent colony attacked and burned, families trapped, a community reduced to ash and silence within hours. On the other side is the problem faced by anyone with a legacy to protect. What does a prominent name do when blood becomes a headline, and the headline becomes a question about moral authority? The scandal did not merely threaten a company, it threatened the idea that the nation's most celebrated fortunes could remain separate from the consequences of the systems that fed them. John D. Rockefeller Jr. becomes the symbol, not because he personally lit a match, but because symbolism is how the public translates complexity into accountability. He represented money that did not have to be present to be powerful, ownership that could be expressed through boards, executives, and layers of decision-making that looked legal, even when the outcome looked unforgivable. In the days and weeks after April 20th, the question that hung in the air was not subtle. If this happened under the shadow of a major American fortune, how could that fortune remain socially clean afterward? If the dead included children, what could possibly sanitize the distance between a polished public image and a burned-out camp? What follows is not a story about a single riot, nor a sentimental retelling designed to comfort the viewer with easy villains. It is an inquiry into how outrage gets processed, how moral shock can be converted into order, and how the architecture of respectability can be rebuilt around a name that should have been permanently stained. The early 20th century did not lack anger. It lacked permanence of consequence. The cycle was familiar even then. A violent episode, public revulsion, official language, administrative distance, and eventually a new calm in which the institutions remain standing. And this is where Ludlow becomes more than Ludlow. It becomes a test case for modern reputation itself, whether a prominent heir could be associated with a national wound and still be permitted a clean exit, socially, politically, historically. The answer cannot be found in a single speech or a single article, because reputations rarely survive by arguing innocence. They survive by narrowing the meaning of an event until the only remaining lesson is procedural, unfortunate, complex, regrettable, resolved. The real question is not whether people were outraged. They were. The question is how that outrage was guided into forms that could be absorbed, how the story could be retold without a permanent stain attaching to the people whose names mattered most. If you want continuous access to the paper trail, statements, hearings, and the language that turns catastrophe into resolution, subscribe to Beyond the Golden Halls and leave a like only if you recognize the moment when a record becomes a locked door. Because the entry point is not a theory, it is a date and a name and an ash field that could not speak for itself. In the next moments, we step into April 20th, 1914, where the scandal begins as a human wound and where the first surviving evidence is as plain as ink on a calendar. Ludlow. A file waits, closed, somewhere it was never meant to be opened. In May 1914, the record shifts from smoke and bodies to paper, and the change is not subtle. A tent colony can burn in a day, but the first thing that tries to settle afterward is the story, not the facts. The story. In New York City, weeks after April 20th, the language that newspapers begin repeating about Ludlow starts to sound less like reporting and more like a prepared position. Phrases that arrive already shaped, already balanced, already careful about where responsibility is allowed to land. The trace is plain because it carries an odd kind of confidence. It reads like something written for circulation, not discovery. A bulletin, an information summary, a press packet. Whatever name sits on the top page, the function is the same. It does not ask what happened. It answers what the public should conclude while the public is still asking. In a moment when witnesses are traumatized, when bodies have just been counted, when the country is still arguing over what it has seen, this document behaves as if the argument has already been decided. The first thing you notice is standardization. The sentences are built to travel. Blame is distributed without being placed. Regret is expressed without ownership. The National Guard becomes a tragic presence, not an actor with agency. The colony becomes a disturbance, not a community of families. The dead become numbers that can be debated, not names that can be grieved. The entire event is framed as a collapse of order rather than an exercise of power. And the most important feature is what the packet will not do. It will not allow the public to keep one clear moral picture in focus for long enough to become permanent. This is why the document shouldn't exist in the form it does. Not because institutions do not communicate, they do, but because this kind of communication is too early, too cohesive, too strategically calm for a catastrophe that is still unresolved. It arrives like a bridge built in advance of the river it claims to cross. It treats a national wound as an issue of management, as if the scandal is not the burning of a colony, but the burning of reputation. The entity behind the air of authority is not mysterious in shape, even if the signatures are not always printed. The packet sits inside the orbit of Rockefeller-linked public messaging in New York and the corporate side of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. You do not need to imagine a conspiracy to see the chain of access. In 1914, the Rockefeller name does not operate by shouting. It operates by offices, counsel, intermediaries, and a disciplined understanding of how newspapers function. Editors need copy, correspondents need verified statements, and the public needs a frame that feels stable, enough to repeat at breakfast. So the action of power here is not a gunshot, it is a distribution. A narrative is circulated to newspapers in a form designed to be reused, quoted, summarized, and reprinted. That circulation is a concrete act, prepared language moving from a private office circle into public channels, while the public still believes it is witnessing raw truth. The mechanism is not secrecy. The mechanism is substitution. Replace the open, angry question, who did this and why, with a calmer, narrower question. How do we restore order? How do we prevent another disturbance? How do we avoid extremes on both sides? Once you see the pattern, you can measure it. The language tends to do three things at the same time. First, it isolates the dead from the decisions that made them vulnerable. A tent colony becomes an unfortunate setting rather than the result of a company town system and a strike that forced families into canvas. Second, it reduces intentionality. The burning becomes a result or a development, not an act carried out in a specific place against a specific group. Third, it introduces a moral escape hatch. Expressions of sympathy that function as closure, even while responsibility remains unassigned, and the consequence is real, not theoretical. When language becomes standardized, interpretation becomes guided. Editors and readers begin repeating a clean version of events before investigators, commissions, and the slow grind of testimony have time to settle. The public is nudged toward a conclusion that feels reasonable because it is phrased as reasonableness. It turns outrage into a debate over tone. It turns a moral rupture into a controversy that can be balanced. And it makes the most dangerous idea of all sound like moderation. That the event was terrible, yes, but also complicated. And therefore no single name should bear the full weight. This is where Rockefeller Jr.'s clean exit begins to look less like an escape and more like a constructed pathway. Not constructed with lies you can easily debunk, but constructed with emphasis and omission. The packet does not need to deny that people died. Death is too public for denial. It only needs to deny the public a stable target for consequence. It needs to keep the story from hardening into a verdict. The pressure point, in May 1914, is that the country is watching. The Ludlow deaths are not a local rumor. They are a national scandal, argued in newspapers and in political circles, and tied to a name large enough to symbolize industrial America itself. That is why the Rockefeller orbit could not wait for history to write the first draft. In crises like this, time is not neutral. The first narrative that feels official tends to become the one that later reporting is forced to respond to, rather than replace. So the action taken is early control of phrasing. Who is blamed? What is minimized? What is described as regrettable? What is treated as unavoidable? You can hear the discipline in the tone. It is not emotional. It is managerial. It reads like a document meant to be placed on a desk, not a confession meant to be heard. And that tone matters because it signals the intended audience. This is written for gatekeepers, editors, clergy, civic leaders, businessmen, people who do not want to feel complicit but also do not want disorder to appear justified. The packet offers them a way to mourn without demanding punishment. It offers them an interpretation that preserves their idea of the nation. Tragic, yes, shameful perhaps, but still governable, still respectable, still safe for capital. Meanwhile, the people harmed by this process are not abstract. They are the families whose voices become less urgent, The moment a standardized narrative is circulating, they are the survivors whose testimonies now sound biased, because an official-sounding version has already claimed the center. They are the dead, including children, whose names begin to vanish. Behind phrasing like casualties and unfortunate incidents, in a moral sense, the second erasure begins here. Not the burning of tents, but the smoothing of meaning. There is also a second, quieter consequence: institutional insulation. If the public is guided into seeing Ludlow as a breakdown of order rather than an application of force, then the institutions involved, state power, corporate governance, elite ownership, remain legitimate even as the event that exposed their brutality is acknowledged. The outrage becomes survivable, not because people did not care, but because the language offered them a way to care without insisting on structural accountability. This is the investigative tension that makes May 1914 different from April 1914. In April, the scandal is physical and immediate. In May, it becomes administrative. The question is no longer only what happened at Ludlow. The question becomes, who moved fast enough to pre-write the public's understanding of it, and why? Were they confident they could do so? If a tragedy gets a script within weeks, do you think truth is being reported or managed? The paper trail does not resolve the mystery, but it changes what the mystery is. It tells you that the cleanup was not only about property or policing, it was about interpretation. It was about building a clean exit route for a name that could not afford to be permanently attached to a burned colony. And once you accept that, you have to look for the next step. Because a prepared narrative does not circulate by accident. Someone authorizes it. Someone chooses the verbs. Someone decides which facts will be treated as central and which will be treated as noise. That decision, who intervened and how formally, will not appear in the pages meant for the public. It will appear in the records meant for insiders, correspondence, instructions, approvals, and the quiet architecture of reputation work. The surviving image is almost mundane, which is part of its power. A stapled packet, dated May 1914, handled enough times to soften the edges, carrying language that sounds finished while the truth is still unsettled. Paper that feels like closure before justice has even found its footing. By June 1914, the danger was no longer confined to Colorado, and it was no longer limited to what had happened on April 20th. The danger had moved into the only place where certain fortunes could actually be wounded, the national vocabulary. In the United States, that summer, a name did not need to be convicted to be damaged. It only needed to become shorthand. Once a name becomes the word people use when they mean impunity, the courts become almost irrelevant. Reputation does the work that law often refuses to do, and it does it faster. The surviving paper from May already shows the first phase of control, language that travels. June shows why that control had to accelerate. This was the era when scandal could be national, when newspapers could carry moral pressure across states, when investigative reporting had learned how to make private power legible to ordinary readers. The progressive era was not a soft background. It was a hostile climate for any industrial dynasty trying to keep a clean public face while the bodies were still being counted. What made Ludlow uniquely dangerous was that it did not present as a technical dispute. It presented as a burned settlement of families, with children among the dead, and a public that did not argue. Policy first. They argued blood and whether anyone with power would ever pay for it. The risk to the Rockefeller name was specific, and it was measurable. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was not a distant abstraction. He was the visible heir of the country's most recognized fortune, and he was connected, through ownership and governance, to Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. That connection could be explained in corporate terms, but the public did not live in corporate terms. The public lived in moral terms, and morally the sequence looked brutal and simple. A company tied to an elite name, a strike, a tent colony, an attack, fire, dead families, and then, almost immediately, a calm stream of statements designed to soften the edges. That is what reputational risk looks like in real time. It is not fear of a lawsuit. It is fear of an adjective. It is fear that Rockefeller becomes the adjective that sits next to Ludlow, that Rockefeller becomes what people say when they mean massacre, and that the name can never again be used in public life without dragging the image of a burned camp behind it. On June 10th, 1914, the problem was not only that the story persisted, the problem was that it could harden. Once a scandal hardens, it stops being an event and becomes a symbol, and symbols do not respond to evidence the way events do. They respond to repetition. That is why the corporate side and the office circle around Rockefeller-linked messaging needed to act in a particular way. Not to refute, but to reframe. Not to confess, but to reassign meaning. Not to solve the moral issue, but to manage the public's capacity to keep seeing it as moral. The concrete action of power in June is the systematic use of intermediaries and friendly channels to control framing. It is not a single press release, and it is not an open debate. It is the disciplined circulation of official language through outlets that want to sound responsible and through messengers who can speak without sounding like the accused. In practical terms, it looks like corporate statements drafted to be quoted, spokesmen positioned to sound measured, and lines of argument designed to move attention away from agency and toward inevitability. Regrettable clash, tragic misunderstanding, disorder on both sides, an unfortunate outcome of tensions. This is power exercised through wording, but wording with consequences. Because in 1914, philanthropic ambitions and social legitimacy were not separate from scandal. They were dependent on insulation from it. The Rockefeller network was already tied to institutions that required public trust: universities, churches, civic boards, foundations, cultural projects. Influence did not come only from money. It came from the ability to enter rooms without being treated as contaminated. A name that becomes nationally synonymous with labor violence threatens that entry. It threatens the ability to lead without protest, to donate without rejection, to build institutions without the public insisting that the same hand that gives can also burn. That is the real consequence, and it is not hypothetical. Once a name becomes shorthand for massacre, it threatens philanthropy, influence networks, and social legitimacy. Donations begin to look like laundering. Public appearances begin to look like provocation. Alliances with clergy, academics, politicians, and business partners become more fragile because association itself becomes a liability. And in an era of moralized journalism, that fragility can be exploited by anyone willing to keep the wound visible. This is why the fight then was dangerous not only for the elite, but for the people already harmed. When reputations are at stake, the human dead can become secondary to the reputational deadliness of the event. The families at Ludlow are no longer treated as the central reality. They are treated as the central risk. Their suffering becomes the fuel of a public scandal, and scandals invite containment. Containment does not comfort victims. Containment manages them. It restricts what they can force the country to keep seeing. The danger to victims in a reputational war is that truth becomes negotiable by people who have resources. The strongest party is not the one with the clearest memory, it is the one that can afford to repeat its version. The press packet from May is one form of repetition. June adds the next layer, the placement of that repetition into channels that can bless it with respectability. A narrative does not need to be believed by everyone. It only needs to be believed by enough gatekeepers that the responsible tone becomes the default tone. Once that happens, the victim's language becomes emotional, while the institution's language becomes balanced. That shift matters because it changes what the public thinks it is allowed to demand. A public can demand justice when it feels morally certain. A public tends to demand reform and healing when it is guided into moral ambiguity. And moral ambiguity is a gift to any powerful network because ambiguity delays consequences. It buys time. It allows private decisions to be made behind closed doors while the public debates vocabulary. By June 1914, the stakes were also political. The federal government was already engaged in broader inquiries into industrial conflict, and the national mood was sensitive to the idea that concentrated private power could operate beyond accountability. This is the environment in which corporate statements become more than public relations. They become a protective layer between a dynasty and the possibility of formal scrutiny. The more responsible and regretful the public record appears, the easier it is for institutions to treat the matter as managed. Managed matters attract fewer interventions than explosive ones, so the danger was twofold. For Rockefeller Jr., the danger was permanent association, his name welded to a national moral wound. For the victims and their memory, the danger was institutional absorption. Ludlow reclassified from a moral rupture into a regrettable episode that the nation could file away as complex. In that classification, the children are not denied. They are simply moved out of the center. The outrage is not denied. It is simply redirected into something that does not demand a specific reckoning. And that brings us back to the most revealing aspect of June: speed. When an elite network moves quickly to standardize language after bloodshed, it is not merely trying to calm the public. It is trying to prevent the public from learning how to speak about what happened in a way that cannot be softened later. The earliest framing often becomes the frame that survives, not because it is true, but because it is first, and because it arrives with the authority of institutions that know how to sound calm while exercising control. If you read the surviving statements from that period with a cold eye, you can see the strategy without needing a confession. The strategy is to keep responsibility distributed, to keep agency blurred, to keep the name from becoming a fixed moral label. It is to turn a massacre into an incident, and then to turn an incident into a chapter that the country can close. But a strategy like that has a weak point, and it always does. The weak point is that the calm public language has to be authorized somewhere in private. Someone has to approve the posture. Someone has to choose the intermediaries. Someone has to decide which facts are allowed to enter the official telling and which are treated as inflammatory. And in a system built on reputation, those choices tend to be documented, quietly, administratively, in correspondence and internal instructions that were never meant to face the public. The image that survives from June is not a burning tent. It is a different kind of heat. A clean typed page, aligned margins, careful phrases sent from a New York office into the bloodstream of American newspapers, as if the event could be cooled by wording. The tension is simple and unresolved. If the framing was this organized this early, where is the moment of authorization? The private decision that turned a massacre into a manageable story? And who exactly signed off on the language that let a name walk away clean? In the last days of April 1914, the public still thought Ludlow was an event that would unfold on its own terms. Testimony, outrage, political pressure, the slow settling of facts. Inside Rockefeller's inner circle, the posture was already changing. The shift was not rhetorical, it was procedural. Within weeks of April 20th, distance stopped being a protective stance and became a liability that needed to be managed. The decision point is visible not because someone announced it, but because the machinery around the story begins to behave differently. The tone of public statements tightens. Access becomes shaped rather than tolerated. Information stops moving like debris from a disaster and starts moving like a product. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone with authority decides that the scandal is no longer a matter to endure, it is a matter to intervene in. On April 28, 1914, the choice becomes legible in the record as an internal alignment. Rockefeller's office circle, Colorado Fuel and Iron Company leadership, and a professional operator brought in to translate chaos into usable materials. This is where Ivy Lee enters the picture, not as a symbol, but as a function. His value was not that he could spin a story in the vulgar sense. His value was that he could make a crisis behave like a campaign problem, organized, paced, responsive, controlled in its angles, controlled in its inputs, controlled in what it allowed the public to keep seeing. The decision does not read like moral debate. It reads like administration. The underlying logic is simple and cold. Ludlow had created a narrative the Rockefeller name could not afford to host, a massacre associated with corporate ownership, state force, and dead families. If that narrative hardened, it would outlive any legal maneuver. It would attach itself to Rockefeller Jr.'s public presence the way soot attaches to fabric. No matter how often the garment is cleaned, the stain remains visible in certain light. So the intervention needed to be immediate, systematic, and disciplined. This is the moment when communication becomes a form of power exercised over reality. Once Ivy Lee is in the loop, messaging stops being a sequence of reactions and becomes a structure. Bulletins are prepared to travel through newspapers with minimal friction. Information summaries are written in a tone that sounds official enough to be repeated without embarrassment by editors who want to appear responsible. The language standardizes what is blamable, what is regrettable, and what is declared outside anyone's control. It does not deny tragedy, it reassigns its meaning, and the decisive act is not merely writing, it is authorization. A closed-door agreement effectively declares that the flow of facts will be routed through controlled channels, that routing is a concrete action of power. Access is restricted, emphasis is selected in advance, and the public's line of sight is managed as if it were a resource. In practical terms, it looks like this. Statements are issued through intermediaries rather than directly. Questions are answered in formats that limit follow-up. Sympathetic language is deployed that implies concern while avoiding responsibility, and reporters are fed prepared materials that make the balanced version easier to publish than the raw, accusatory one. The consequence is immediate and real. The scandal stops behaving like an uncontrolled event and starts behaving like a campaign problem. You can see it in the rhythm. Events still happen, investigations, hearings, public anger, but the story the public receives begins to arrive with guardrails. The colony at Ludlow is no longer allowed to remain the central image for long. The dead families are acknowledged, then gently moved aside by language that pulls the reader toward complexity, toward tensions, toward the idea that responsibility cannot be placed cleanly on a name. The moral center of the event is softened not by contradiction, but by management. This is what makes the decision to intervene such a decisive turn in the chain of power. It does not erase the dead, It erases the public's ability to keep the dead at the center of the narrative without being told they are unreasonable for doing so. It turns a massacre into a problem of perception while still pretending to speak in the language of civic calm. It does not ask the public to forget. It teaches the public how to remember in a way that costs the powerful as little as possible. And the logic of the meeting, explicit or implicit, would have been understood by everyone in the room. Without saying it out loud, courts were uncertain, politics could swing, but reputation, once damaged, could block access to boards, foundations, elite alliances, and philanthropic legitimacy for years. The Rockefeller name did not merely represent money, it represented authority that depended on public toleration. If Rockefeller became nationally synonymous with Ludlow, that toleration could fracture. Donations could start looking like laundering. Institutional partners could start distancing themselves. The family's social legitimacy, its ability to move through American public life without protest, could become contested in ways money alone could not solve. So the intervention is chosen, and it is chosen early. It is chosen while the country is still raw enough to be guided. That timing is part of the act. A narrative, if planted in the first weeks, can become the baseline that later reporting must negotiate with rather than replace. This is why the materials are prepared so quickly. The intent is not to prove innocence. The intent is to prevent the public from learning a single stable moral sentence it can repeat for decades. There is a secondary consequence that matters just as much. Once professional messaging becomes systematic, it creates a paper trail of its own. Not the paper trail meant for the public, the bulletins and summaries, but the internal trail of approvals, instructions and coordination. Someone had to authorize Ivy Lee's role. Someone had to agree on posture. Someone had to decide what information would be highlighted and what would be treated as inflammatory. That means the intervention, if it is real, is not only visible in outcomes, it is visible in process. And that is where the injustice stays alive in a different form. Louis Ticus and the families at Ludlow are not simply victims of violence. They become victims of an administrative afterlife in which their deaths are processed as a reputational hazard. The same structure that could burn a colony could also reduce the colony to a talking point, tragic, regrettable, complicated, while the name most exposed to consequence begins to find a path out of the smoke. If you want to understand how that path was built, you do not look first for dramatic confessions. You look for the moment the crisis becomes managed. You look for the first formal signs of coordination. Who met, who was consulted, who was given authority, what channels were chosen, what language was approved for. Repetition. Because the moral event at Ludlow did not end when the tents burned. It continued in the decisions that followed, decisions that determined whether the country would remember Ludlow as a permanent stain or as a regrettable chapter that responsible people could close. And by late April into May 1914, the record begins to suggest that closure was being engineered. Not openly, not crudely, but methodically, through access, through phrasing, through intermediaries, through the deliberate construction of a version of events that could be carried by respectable voices without forcing those voices to accuse a dynasty. The surviving image from this turning point is almost sterile. A typed memorandum circulated inside an office with the calm architecture of a plan, clean margins, measured sentences, and a list of talking points that treat the ashes of Ludlow as a communications problem to be solved. The tension that remains unresolved is sharper than the tone allows. If Ivy Lee was brought in to make the scandal manageable, where is the internal instruction that defined what the public was not allowed to keep seeing? And who, exactly, approved the first set of controlled materials that turned a massacre into a campaign? What was altered was not the fact of Ludlow. The tents still burned. The deaths still occurred. The outrage still rose. The alteration was more precise than forgery and more durable than denial. It was curation, selecting which parts of reality would be permitted to carry authority when the country demanded an account, and which parts would be left to witnesses, grief, and controversy. By January 1915, the machinery that began in late April and May 1914 had matured into something that could survive official scrutiny. The public-facing posture of John D. Rockefeller Jr. was no longer improvised. It was consolidated. It had been rehearsed in bulletins, refined in statements, and hardened into a vocabulary designed to travel through institutions without leaving fingerprints. The proof of that consolidation was not a private memo alone. It was the moment the posture was required to perform under formal pressure. His appearance in Washington, D.C., before the United States Commission on Industrial Relations on January 25-26, 1915. This is the concrete artifact of alteration, the transformation of a scandal into a manageable script at the very point where the public expects raw accountability. A commission hearing sounds like sunlight. It sounds like the nation finally looking directly at power, but the kind of power at stake here does not rely on darkness. It relies on controlled illumination, light pointed carefully, with certain areas left out of frame. The alteration happens first in preparation. In any such hearing, testimony is not merely spoken, it is engineered. The questions are anticipated. The boundaries of admissible language are set in advance. Talking points are arranged not as propaganda, but as discipline. What can be conceded without accepting culpability? What can be described as tragic without being described as chosen? What can be regretted without being owned? That is an action of power in itself. The act of restricting language before it reaches the public record, not by censorship, but by preloading the speaker with a framework that will make full responsibility linguistically difficult to deliver. And the framework has a recognizable structure. Regret is treated as a moral expression that costs nothing. Responsibility is treated as an accusation that must be avoided. Order is treated as a civic necessity. Violence is treated as a breakdown without authorship. Information is treated as neutral. Witness is treated as interested. The words are not selected for poetry. They are selected for outcome. They are designed to disperse condemnation into procedure, to shift blame from persons to processes, and to turn the public's moral demand, who did this, into an administrative question. What should be improved? This is not abstract. It changes what a nation hears when a powerful man speaks under oath. A witness can describe what was done. A prepared posture describes what is unfortunate. A witness can name the people harmed. A prepared posture names principles, stability, order, responsibility in the vague sense, peace. The harm remains real, but it is relocated from the center of the narrative to the margins of a civic lecture. On January 25, 1915, Washington becomes the stage where this curated posture is tested. A federal commission exists precisely because the country believes something more than regret occurred, that industrial conflict had crossed into a form of impunity that demanded public accounting. But the curated posture is built to survive that belief without yielding to it. It can acknowledge sorrow, it can praise fairness, it can lament tensions, it can even concede that things should have been handled better. What it is, built not to do, is accept that a particular chain of power produced Ludlow as an outcome, and that ownership carries moral weight even when the owner is not present at the scene. The action of power here is semantic framing deployed inside an official proceeding. Under oath, Rockefeller Jr.'s posture can present itself as conscience while functioning as strategy. It can appear earnest while remaining structurally evasive. It can speak of regret while keeping responsibility distributed across layers. The guard, the managers, the circumstances, the strike, the unfortunate escalation. The language performs innocence not by claiming no one died, but by suggesting that death occurred in a realm where no clear hand can be named. The consequence is real and public. A commission hearing produces a record. Newspapers quote it. Civic leaders reference it. The middle of the country absorbs it as what he said. And if what he said is carefully curated, then the record becomes a tool, one that can be cited later as proof that the matter was faced, addressed, and put into the category of governance rather than guilt. This is how a clean exit pathway is manufactured, not by persuading everyone, but by creating an official-looking narrative that allows the respectable classes to move on without feeling they have abandoned morality. That clean pathway matters because it changes the social cost of continued outrage. After testimony like this enters the public record, anyone who continues to insist on personal responsibility can be treated as excessive or politically motivated or unwilling to accept progress. The scandal becomes manageable, not because the wound healed, but because the wound was given an administrative bandage that allows institutions to function while the injury remains underneath. And for the victims, the injustice deepens in a quieter way. Louis Ticus does not return to life because a commission heard words. The families do not regain the colony that was erased because a powerful man expressed regret. What changes is not their loss. What changes is the public's relationship to their loss. The dead become a reference point, and then a footnote, and then a symbol invoked when useful, while the corporate and philanthropic machinery tied to the Rockefeller name continues to operate with restored legitimacy. This is what curating history means in practice. You do not need to invent new facts. You only need to decide which facts will be allowed to carry institutional weight. A commission record becomes the polished surface. Eyewitness accounts become noise. A prepared posture becomes the thing that future commentators treat as the official moment of accountability, even if the language never truly accepted accountability at all. When powerful people testify, are we hearing a conscience or a strategy? There is also a second, more durable consequence. Once a curated posture succeeds in an official forum, it becomes a template. It can be reused whenever similar crises emerge. The language of regret without responsibility becomes a pattern that institutions recognize and replicate. The procedure becomes normal. A tragedy is met with a statement. A statement becomes a record. A record becomes closure. The public is not forced to forget. It is trained to accept a certain kind of ending. But any curated record has a vulnerability. The vulnerability is preparation itself, because preparation leaves seams, drafts, coaching, selected terms, decisions about what to concede and what to deny. If the posture was consolidated ahead of January 25, 26, 1915, then the consolidation occurred somewhere, inside an office, inside correspondence, inside a set of instructions that defined what the testimony needed to accomplish. That is the next investigative pressure point, because it is one thing to watch a powerful man speak carefully. It is another to locate the machinery that taught him how. The closing image is not a riot. It is a room in Washington where language is treated like evidence and evidence is treated like language. A witness chair, a stack of prepared notes kept close to the hand, and a federal record being created line by line. Clean enough to cite, controlled enough to survive, and still unable to answer the simplest moral question that Ludlow left behind. In 1915, after the hearing record had been created and the national outrage had been given an official surface to slide across, the question of benefit becomes easier to answer precisely because the system did not collapse. A catastrophe like Ludlow produces two possible outcomes. Either power is disrupted or power absorbs the shock and continues. When power continues, the beneficiaries are rarely the ones who suffered. They are the ones who kept control, while the country was encouraged to accept reform as a substitute for culpability. The named beneficiary inside the corporate structure is L.M. Bowers, the president of Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, and the governance layer around him. In 1915, a company like CF&I did not need to win an argument in public to win in reality. It needed to keep the levers of ownership and management stable while the public demanded an accounting. That stability is not accidental. It is produced by a deliberate redirection of accountability away from individuals and toward process, toward lessons learned, toward administrative improvements that sound moral but do not redistribute power. The concrete action of power here is not loud, it is managerial. After January 26, 1915, the language of consequence is steered into reforms that preserve the underlying structure. Committees, policies, industrial relations programs framed as progress. The public is given a story that sounds like response, procedures adjusted, communication improved, grievances heard, while the question that would threaten the hierarchy is quietly avoided. Who in the chain of ownership and governance bears moral responsibility when state force and private guards erase a tent colony? That avoidance is itself an action. It declares, in effect, that the event will be treated as a malfunction rather than a choice. Malfunctions call for repairs. Choices call for blame and removal. By treating Ludlow as something to be addressed rather than something to be owned, the corporate layer protects itself from the only consequence that would matter: loss of position, loss of authority, loss of influence over the company's future. And the consequence is real and measurable in the institutional landscape. The system stays intact. Ownership power remains stable. Control over CF&I's operations remains in the hands of the same corporate governance class. The outrage is not allowed to become a mechanism of displacement. It is rerouted into managed reforms, reforms that can be cited as proof of moral seriousness while leaving the architecture of power essentially untouched. This is where the benefit extends beyond CF&I and into the Rockefeller-linked influence structures. Social legitimacy is not an ornament for a dynasty. It is an operating requirement. Philanthropy, civic leadership, institutional partnerships, these are all forms of influence that depend on being treated as acceptable. A permanent association with massacre would have threatened that acceptability. So the benefit of the 1915 posture is not simply that Rockefeller Jr. avoided a courtroom verdict. It is that he secured a pathway back into the public sphere with a record that could be quoted as accountability without becoming confession. You can see the structure of the benefit in how condemnation is dispersed. When a scandal is framed as a process failure, the moral energy of the public is absorbed into solutions that do not target people. Committees can be formed, principles can be affirmed, standards can be discussed. That feels like action. It gives the public something to point to, but it also ensures that the individuals most connected to the underlying power are not made to carry the full moral weight. The blame becomes procedural, and procedure has no face. For the corporate governance layer, this is an ideal outcome. It allows executives to present themselves as rational stewards responding to unfortunate events, rather than as actors who benefited from a climate in which lethal force could be used to break a strike. For the Rockefeller-linked network, it restores the conditions necessary for long-term influence, the ability to donate, to build, to partner, to appear as a moral force in national life, all while the event that should have challenged that moral standing is reclassified as a managed episode in industrial history. The injustice stays alive because the people harmed by Ludlow do not receive an equivalent restoration. The families do not regain the community that was erased. The dead do not regain their names in the national record in the way a dynasty regains its legitimacy. The public is given reforms, but the victims were not asking for improved procedures. They were asking for accountability that recognizes agency. When that request is converted into process, the moral demand is not fulfilled. It is transformed into something safer for power. This is the deeper benefit that hides behind the surface of reform: control over meaning. If the public accepts that the lesson of Ludlow is primarily administrative, better communication, better oversight, better industrial relations, then the public is less likely to insist on the lesson that would threaten the hierarchy. That concentrated ownership, when paired with state force and private security, can erase communities and then survive through management of reputation. So who benefited in 1915? The answer is not a single man smiling at a desk. It is a layer of governance that kept its hands on the levers while the country was invited to applaud the idea of improvement. It is executives like Monsieur Bowers, whose authority remained structurally protected even as the company's moral standing was contested. It is the Rockefeller-linked legitimacy machine, which secured a pathway back into acceptable public life by converting blood into a policy conversation. And the method by which that benefit was secured is itself part of the evidence. A scandal that should have demanded moral reckoning is redirected into reform language. Reform language becomes the official memory. Official memory becomes the shield that allows the structure to remain standing. The outrage does not disappear. It is processed, channeled into forms that do not destabilize ownership. That processing has a human cost beyond the obvious. It teaches the public a pattern that even the most infamous labor violence can be absorbed without a lasting stain on the people whose names matter most. It teaches institutions that controlled concession is safer than denial. It teaches power that responsibility can be replaced by regret, and that regret, when delivered in the right forum, can become a currency that buys continued legitimacy. The surviving image from 1915 is therefore not only Rockefeller Jr. at a commission table. It is the corporate world behind him remaining operational, board minutes still being filed, executive authority still recognized, ownership still secure, the company still functioning as an engine of profit and control. And somewhere beneath that operational calm is the unresolved tension that refuses to settle. If the beneficiaries of Ludlow's aftermath were the people who kept power, what precisely was removed from the public record to make that outcome seem acceptable, and who decided which kind of accountability the nation was allowed to receive? What disappeared first was not the word Ludlow. The word survived. It had the right qualities to survive. It was short, it was sharp, it could be used as accusation, as shorthand, as a scandal label. What disappeared first were the people inside the word, the names, the faces, the immigrant families whose lives did not come with institutional protection, and whose deaths could be absorbed into a national argument without requiring the country to keep seeing them as individuals. The mechanism of erasure begins with something brutally physical. On April 20th, 1914, the tent colony is attacked, set on fire, and effectively erased as a living community in a single day. That is the first disappearance. The loss of the space where people existed together, where memory could have remained visible through continuity, through tense, routines, familiar objects, the simple fact of a community still present to be visited, photographed, described. When the colony is destroyed, what remains is not only grief, what remains is a record problem. A burned settlement produces ash, scattered belongings, displaced survivors, and a public narrative that quickly becomes louder than the survivors' ability to document what was lost. The second disappearance is administrative. The human record fragments. Names become partial lists. The dead are counted in competing accounts. The accounts are filtered through institutions that do not share the same incentives. Some witnesses name the dead with precision because they have to live with them. Other channels prefer generalities because generalities travel without forcing responsibility to land on someone's doorstep. In that environment, the people most likely to vanish from public memory are the ones already treated as marginal. Immigrant miners and their families, the households whose names are unfamiliar to mainstream editors, whose faces do not appear in the society pages, whose English is imperfect, whose stories do not align with the comfortable idea of American progress. The concrete action of power here is not a single act like a signature on a hearing transcript. It is omission, selective reporting, and selective amplification that effectively removes individual lives from the durable public record while preserving the scandal as a concept. When a tragedy is processed through press and institutional channels, what becomes stable is not necessarily what is most true. What becomes stable is what is easiest to repeat, easiest to categorize, and least likely to trigger lasting consequence for powerful actors. By December 1914, you can already see how the disappearance works in practice. The story is still alive, but it is increasingly alive in the abstract. Ludlow as a symbol of labor violence, Ludlow as a reference point in debates about industrial relations, Ludlow as a stain that certain people need to manage. Meanwhile, the individual identities inside the event begin to fade into roles: miners, women, children, strikers, guards. Even Louis Ticas, whose name can still be stated, starts to function more like a marker than a person. The more the narrative becomes a national argument, the easier it becomes for human detail to be treated as excess. This is not incidental. It is what happens when reputational management and official language begin to dominate the record. The curated posture that protected elite legitimacy in 1915 did not need to erase the dead. It only needed to prevent the dead from being the center of the enduring story. A name like Rockefeller's is protected when the public memory moves away from faces and toward procedure. Procedure can be debated without moral permanence. Faces cannot. And you can see who carried memory forward, because that work leaves traces as well. The United Mine Workers of America becomes a key anchor, not because it controlled national newspapers, but because it refused to allow the human element to vanish entirely. The union's role was not merely organizing, it was preservation. It kept lists, testimonies, and commemorations alive in the face of institutional indifference. But there is a difference between carrying memory and having memory amplified. Institutions do not amplify equally. A union can hold a truth, but it cannot force elite channels to treat that truth as central rather than partisan. So the disappearance is not total. It is uneven. The word Ludlow stays loud in the national imagination precisely because it is useful. It can be invoked by reformers, by critics, by defenders, by anyone who needs an example. But the individuals inside Ludlow become background noise, because individual lives complicate. The clean narratives that powerful institutions prefer. Names force specificity, faces force accountability, and accountability in this story is what the system has repeatedly learned how to redirect. The result is a specific kind of public memory, scandal without sustained human witness. People remember Ludlow as something shameful that happened in the early 20th century, a flashpoint in labor history, a controversy that forced reforms. But they do not remember the tent colony as a lived place with families who had routines and voices. They do not remember the immigrant households as people whose deaths were not abstract costs of progress, but personal catastrophes with names that deserved to remain speakable. That is what disappeared between 1914 and 1915, the capacity of the event to remain morally anchored in individuals rather than in institutional language. Once the story is reclassified as a case and a lesson, the victims become interchangeable. Their suffering becomes evidence rather than memory, and evidence, unlike memory, can be filed, summarized, and moved aside once it has served its purpose. The injustice is sharpened by the fact that the physical destruction of the colony did not only destroy shelter, it destroyed the most basic infrastructure for documentation. When people are displaced, when belongings are scattered, when survivors are forced into instability, the ability to preserve records collapses. Names are misspelled, dates blur, lists conflict. And in a media environment where power is actively shaping the narrative, those conflicts become convenient. A fragmented record can be treated as unreliable. A partial list can be treated as uncertain. Uncertainty can be used as an excuse for moral distance. And yet, the disappearance leaves a silhouette. The outline of what is missing becomes part of the evidence. When a scandal is famous but its victims are not, something has been filtered. When an event is remembered as a word but not as a set of lives, memory has been curated. The colony is gone, the faces fade, the names thin out, and what remains is a symbol that can be managed, debated, and eventually absorbed into the nation's ability to move on. The surviving image from this stage is not a burning tent. It is a compromised ledger of the dead, partial lists in newspapers, conflicting counts, names that appear once and never again, and a union archive trying to hold together what the national record keeps letting slip. The tension that remains unresolved is direct, and it points forward. If individual lives were allowed to fade while the scandal word survived, which institution decided what would be preserved as history and what would be left to disappear as mere noise? There is a detail in this story that does not align, and it is not a missing signature or a disputed count of the dead. It is a mismatch of tempo. The violence at Ludlow is abrupt, visible, and morally legible. The calm that follows, in elite language, arrives too quickly, too smoothly, as if the most unstable event in the country could be handled like an inconvenience. The contradiction is not emotional. It is structural. One side of the nation is on fire in the public mind, and the other side is already speaking as if the fire belongs to the past. The anchor for this misalignment is not a protagonist, and it does not require sentiment to function. It is a controlled environment. Kykuit at Pocantico Hills, New York. Its purpose in this investigation is architectural, not biographical. A place like that is built to hold stability. It is designed to keep weather out, sound out, disorder out. It is the kind of space where decisions can be made without the sensory intrusion of the consequences. And the dates matter because the misalignment begins before Ludlow and becomes visible immediately after. In 1913, the country is already in the age of large fortunes, operating through distance. Distance from mines, distance from camps, distance from the people whose bodies absorb the risks of profit. The public knows these fortunes exist, but it rarely sees their internal rhythm. Then, April 20th, 1914 happens, and the distance becomes morally explosive. The tent colony burns, children die, and the public response is not a narrow labor argument, it is outrage that threatens to attach itself to a name. The expectation, in any ordinary moral universe, is that the language around such an event would remain unstable for a long time, that it would keep flaring, that it would resist tidy closure. But what the surviving record shows is something else. Closure language begins to appear early with a suspicious smoothness. It starts as regret without responsibility. It becomes complexity without agency. It becomes restoring order without naming who broke it. And that evolution happens at a speed that is difficult to reconcile with the scale of the wound. This is the investigative trigger, the speed of narrative. Stabilization itself, because stabilization is not a natural phenomenon, it is an action. Stories do not settle on their own in the immediate aftermath of national scandal. Not when newspapers are hungry, when reformers are active, when unions carry testimony, when politicians sense opportunity. When a narrative becomes calm too quickly, it suggests that calm has been produced, not discovered. It suggests that someone decided when outrage was supposed to end, and that decision was implemented. Through channels that can turn moral chaos into acceptable language, Kykuit matters here as an emblem of controlled time. Inside a protected estate environment, you can set the pace of your own reality. You can decide what enters, what is discussed, what is delayed, what is delegated. You can keep the scandal at the level of materials and statements, while the public is still trying to process the fact that families burned in a camp. That is why the misalignment is not merely psychological. It is logistical. It is the difference between people who are forced to live in the immediate aftermath and people who can schedule their response. And the record gives you hints of scheduling. The early press packets and bulletins function like timed interventions. They arrive with language that appears ready before the country has finished asking the most basic questions. They do not sound like the first draft of history. They sound like the second draft, written after someone has decided which meanings must not be allowed to harden. Then, by the time of official scrutiny in January 1915, the posture is fully consolidated, as if the event has already been domesticated into a manageable case. That sequence creates the misalignment. If a massacre produces national outrage, and outrage threatens elite legitimacy, the logical response from the threatened party is either denial or accountability. Instead, what appears is something more refined, controlled closure. It is the kind of closure that permits the public to keep a moral feeling while being guided away from moral consequence. It permits a society to say, "That was terrible," while simultaneously learning how to stop insisting on who should pay for it. The inconsistency becomes sharper when you compare the intensity of the event to the texture of the response. Ludlow is not a small scandal. It is not a private embarrassment. It is a public, photographic, reportable rupture. And yet, the official-sounding language that spreads afterward has an almost antiseptic quality. It treats a burned colony as if it were a civic problem to be corrected. It treats outrage as something to be soothed. It treats responsibility as something that can be redistributed until it dissolves. This is where the estate environment becomes an investigative mirror. A place like Kykuit is not guilty of anything by itself. It is simply built for control. And control in the aftermath of Ludlow is the central phenomenon. The calm is not evidence of innocence, it is evidence of capacity. It tells you who has the infrastructure to absorb shock without appearing shaken. It tells you who can continue operating while the public burns with anger. It tells you who can make time work for them, because time is the raw material of memory. If you can shorten the life of outrage, you can shorten the life of consequence. So the detail that does not align is this: the public fury should have remained volatile longer than it did in the official narrative. Not because people stopped caring, people did not. But the record begins to behave as if caring is supposed to be temporary, as if outrage is supposed to peak, then decline, then be replaced by reform. That arc is not inevitable. It is crafted, and crafting implies a hand. The consequence of noticing this misalignment is not a conclusion. It is a question that becomes harder to avoid. If the narrative stabilized with suspicious smoothness, who determined the timetable? Who decided that Ludlow's meaning should be converted from moral rupture into procedural lesson? And how was that decision enforced through press channels, intermediaries, and official forums? What feels more suspicious to you? What was said after Ludlow? Or how quickly it stopped being said? Because when a scandal as severe as Ludlow becomes linguistically manageable within months, the investigation can no longer focus only on what happened at the colony. It has to focus on the machinery that shortened the life of outrage. It has to look for the points where the public's attention was redirected not by fatigue, but by design. The closing image is not of Colorado. It is of a different kind of landscape, a quiet, controlled estate setting in Pocantico Hills, where the outside world's noise can be filtered, where correspondence can be drafted in clean rooms, where the tone of stability is maintained while the nation argues over fire and blood. The tension remains unresolved and immediate. If outrage ended too neatly, the end was not natural. So where is the internal record that marks the moment someone decided the country had mourned long enough and the story was ready to be closed? The risk was not that Ludlow would be remembered. The risk was that Ludlow would be defined in a way that could not be managed. Defined not as an incident, not as a tragic rupture at the edge of the nation, but as systemic corporate violence with a clear chain of power running from ownership to governance to state force. If that definition had stabilized in 1914-1915, it would not have remained a scandal. It would have threatened to become a structural rupture. The record shows why institutions moved the way they did. In this period, the press was capable of turning private arrangements into public shame, and public shame into political force. The progressive era had already trained readers to suspect that concentrated wealth could hide behind legality while producing outcomes that were morally indefensible. Ludlow fit that suspicion too well. It offered the public an event that looked like proof: a tent colony of striking families attacked and burned, immigrant minors and children dead, and a corporate name large enough to carry the blame into the national imagination. The danger was not simply outrage. Outrage can be waited out. The danger was a sustained headline cycle that would keep the ownership chain in focus long enough for the country to stop treating Ludlow as a dispute and start treating it as a system. On June 15, 1914, the risk becomes visible in how aggressively the language around Ludlow is disciplined. That discipline is not a secondary detail. It is a response to the possibility that the broader press environment could align around a more lethal framing. Not labor unrest, but corporate violence protected by state legitimacy. In a different headline cycle, one with less managed ambiguity, the question would not have remained, what went wrong? It would have become, who authorized a world where this outcome was acceptable? And once that question becomes the national question, it does not stay confined to Colorado. This is where reputational contagion begins to matter, as a real economic force. Elite networks in 1914 did not operate as isolated fortunes. They operated as systems of comfort, banking relationships, partnerships, civic boards, philanthropic alliances, institutional patronage. Those systems depend on a shared assumption that certain names are safe to stand beside, safe to accept money from, safe to partner with without being morally stained. If Rockefeller-linked influence had become permanently welded to the most infamous labor violence in the country, that comfort could have fractured in ways that no courtroom could fully repair. And that is why the containment strategy in this era is so revealing. It is less about censorship and more about definition. The goal is not to hide that a tragedy occurred. The goal is to control what the tragedy was. Was it a deliberate application of force against a community, implicating the governance chain that benefited from it? Or was it an unfortunate escalation amid tensions, regrettable but procedurally complex? These are not rhetorical differences. They determine what kinds of consequences become thinkable. The concrete action of power here is the institutional prioritization of containment through framing, declaring in effect what Ludlow counts as and what it does not. That declaration happens through prepared materials, intermediaries, controlled access, and the steady supply of language that makes one interpretation easier to publish than another. This is how institutions manage risk without appearing to suppress truth. They flood the public space with a vocabulary that keeps the most dangerous meaning from hardening. Because the most dangerous meaning was not simply people died. People die in industrial, in conflict, and institutions know how to absorb that. The most dangerous meaning was ownership has moral liability for violence exercised in its name. If that idea had become the accepted shorthand, it would have changed how the press approached the next labor conflict, how politicians approached investigations, how civic institutions approached donations, and how markets evaluated association. A name treated as morally radioactive does not move through America the same way. Political implications would have followed quickly. A sustained press alignment could have increased labor policy pressure and given federal inquiries sharper teeth, not merely as symbolic hearings, but as instruments with enough public backing to threaten real reforms that redistributed power rather than polishing procedure. Once the narrative becomes systemic, a commission can no longer function as an exit ramp. It becomes an entry point for further action. Elite networks would then face a different calculus, not how to look responsible, but how to prevent legal and political structures from turning moral outrage into enforceable change. So the question, if this had come to light, is not hypothetical in the sentimental sense. The light in question is a specific kind of light, sustained, coherent, and focused on the chain of authority rather than on the chaos of the moment. The record suggests that the people managing the aftermath understood this risk. They behaved as if the worst outcome was not condemnation. The worst outcome was clarity. Clarity is what turns scandal into rupture. Scandal can be managed with statements, philanthropy, a disciplined posture of regret. Structural rupture requires more. It requires that the public keep its eyes on the same mechanism long enough to demand that the mechanism itself be altered. That is why the aftermath in 1914-1915 is so intensely concerned with semantics. Semantics are not ornamental here. They are defensive architecture. And you can trace the defensive logic through the surrounding environments. The national press was not one unified organism, but it was capable of alignment when a moral story became too powerful to ignore. Markets, too, did not need to collapse for discomfort to register. Elite relationships can tighten, invitations can stop, Boards can quietly distance themselves. Philanthropic acceptance can turn conditional. Politics could sharpen under pressure, and pressure could sharpen under headlines. The danger was that Ludlow would become a permanent organizing symbol for the idea that corporate governance could carry blood without consequence. So institutions prioritize containment by controlling the boundary between event and system. They let the public keep an emotional reaction while discouraging a structural conclusion. They encouraged a moral feeling, regret, sorrow, a desire for peace, while preventing that feeling from becoming a stable accusation tied to ownership power. They offered reforms as proof of responsiveness because reforms are the safest form of consequence. They signaled change without requiring removal, redistribution, or personal liability. The real consequence of successful containment is that the difference between scandal and rupture can indeed be one sustained headline cycle. If the dangerous frame does not hold long enough, it becomes history's debate, not history's turning point. It becomes a word, Ludlow, rather than a mechanism the nation refuses to tolerate. And when that happens, power learns something valuable, that it can survive extreme moral exposure as long as it can manage the duration and definition of attention. This is why the speed of closure language remains suspicious. It is not merely that the story calmed down, it is that it calmed down in a way that protected the relationships that mattered most. The corporate governance layer around CF&I, the Rockefeller-linked legitimacy structures, the broader elite comfort that allows wealth to function as authority rather than as mere accumulation. Those structures benefited not from denial, but from containment that looked like responsibility. If this had come fully to light, if the press had held the ownership chain in focus, if the political system had felt compelled to treat Ludlow as systemic rather than incidental, then the protective layer of process reforms might not have been enough. The posture of regret might have been interpreted as evasion. The commission record might have been treated as strategy rather than conscience, and the social legitimacy that allowed a clean exit could have been compromised for a generation. Instead, the record suggests a narrower outcome, a scandal absorbed into managed reforms, with the system intact and the victims increasingly abstracted. That is the victory condition of containment. Not the elimination of outrage, but its conversion into forms that do not threaten the architecture of power. The closing image is simple and concrete. A newspaper desk with stacks of wire reports and editorials, a headline chosen, a definition set, incident instead of system, and a public mood beginning to shift as repetition replaces raw attention. The tension remains unresolved and sharp. If the difference between scandal and rupture was one sustained cycle of clarity, who controlled when that cycle ended? And what exactly was done to keep Ludlow from becoming the kind of headline that could not be managed? In 1915, silence did not arrive as an absence. It arrived as a system. The scandal did not vanish. It was processed until it began to feel administratively resolved and therefore safely historical. That processing relied on a normalization tool more effective than any outright denial, vague institutional language that sounds humane while producing insulation, industrial peace, representation, stability, welfare. Words that imply moral action without requiring moral liability. Normalization is not the same as forgetting. Forgetting is passive. Normalization is active. It is the point at which extraordinary violence is converted into ordinary procedure, and the public is invited to treat the conversion itself as progress. Once that conversion succeeds, outrage becomes a phase rather than a force. It becomes something the nation went through rather than something that still demands consequence. By March 1915, the record around Ludlow begins to show this shift in texture. The language that once carried accusation is increasingly replaced by language that carries administration. The story is no longer framed primarily as burned tents and dead children. It is framed as industrial relations, as labor management, as the need for stability. The moral wound is not denied. It is simply repositioned as the justification for building systems that can prevent future disorder. That justification is what makes normalization socially acceptable, because it allows institutions to claim the moral high ground while changing the subject from culpability to management. The named entity that anchors this design logic is William Lyon Mackenzie King. In 1915, he is not simply a public figure. He becomes tied to a post-crisis labor management framework that treats conflict as something to be engineered into governable channels. His role in the broader story is not melodrama, it is function. He represents an approach that sounds modern and humane: create representation plans, build committees, establish internal channels, produce industrial peace. In a purely procedural sense, these tools can reduce open conflict. In a moral sense, they can also act as insulation. They convert outrage into meetings, and meetings into minutes, and minutes into the appearance of resolution. The concrete action of power here is the creation and adoption of routines that reroute accountability into bureaucracy. Committees are formed. Representation schemes are described as reforms. Formal channels are established for grievances. The corporate response becomes an architecture, something that can be pointed to whenever anyone returns to Ludlow and asks whether the lesson was learned. This architecture does not erase the massacre, it encloses it. It places the event inside a new administrative frame where the dominant question becomes, how do we maintain stability, rather than who carries guilt? This is how silence becomes routine. Not by forbidding speech, but by giving speech a shape that cannot threaten ownership. When outrage is channeled into committees, the most disruptive moral demand is displaced. Committees are designed to produce recommendations, not verdicts. They can acknowledge suffering while leaving the power structure intact. They can promise fairness while reserving decision-making for the same governance layer that benefited from containment in the first place. The language itself performs a quiet kind of power. Industrial peace suggests that conflict is the primary problem, as if the main danger was disorder rather than violence inflicted with impunity. Representation suggests that having a voice inside a structure is equivalent to having power over that structure. Welfare suggests care, while leaving undefined who decides what care looks like and who controls the resources that define it. Stability sounds virtuous, but stability can be another word for uninterrupted control. And the consequences are real, not theoretical. Once a reform system is installed, it changes how the public interacts with the scandal. The existence of a program becomes a substitute for ongoing moral pressure. The program can be cited in newspapers, in speeches, in boardrooms. It becomes the new headline, not what happened at Ludlow, but what was built afterward. That shift is crucial. It moves attention away from the dead and toward the administrators. It moves attention away from burned tents and toward plans. It makes the post-crisis architects look like responsible stewards, even if the foundational injustice was never truly addressed. For the victims, this is a second erasure. The first erasure was physical on April 20th, 1914. The second is rhetorical and institutional. The suffering becomes the origin story of a bureaucratic regime that treats moral catastrophe as a management challenge. The families become evidence used to justify procedures rather than persons whose loss demands reckoning. Their names fade, while the names of planners and mediators become associated with progress. Normalization also has a psychological effect on the wider public. Bureaucracy does something that outrage cannot. It gives people permission to stop feeling urgency. Once the response becomes a system, committees, channels, plans, the scandal begins to feel contained. The public can believe that the matter is being handled. That belief does not require the public to examine whether justice occurred. It requires only that paperwork exists. This is why bureaucracy is such an effective form of insulation. It creates visible activity that is not the same as accountability, and because it is visible, it becomes repeatable. The same phrases can be used whenever a similar crisis threatens elite legitimacy. We are committed to industrial peace. We support representation. We are improving welfare. These phrases form a protective canopy. They allow institutions to absorb moral shock without conceding structural blame. They are not lies in the simplest sense. They are frameworks designed to move the conversation into a safer zone. The deeper investigative point is that normalization is a decision disguised as a process. Someone decides that outrage will be converted into routine. Someone decides that the unit of response will be committees, not consequences. Someone decides that the public will be offered a narrative of progress that does not require moral surrender by those at the top. The system is not born spontaneously from public need. It is designed and adopted by people who understand that procedure can neutralize moral energy. This is where the chain of power becomes quiet but firm. The corporate governance layer retains control. The Rockefeller-linked legitimacy structures regain social comfort. The press is given a new storyline: reform, modernization, stability. The political system can point to responses without forcing deeper confrontation. And the public, exhausted by the intensity of scandal, is offered something attractive, a way to believe the country has moved forward. The scandal is not defeated. It is processed until it feels like an episode the nation has already integrated. That feeling is the true product of normalization. It produces distance. It turns urgency into history. It makes the dead harder to see because the living are now looking at institutions that claim to be better. The closing image is concrete and procedural, a committee agenda on a table typed in calm language: industrial peace, representation, welfare, and a stack of meeting minutes filed neatly as if paper could replace justice. The unresolved tension remains in the gap between what the system records and what it cannot record. If bureaucratic reform became the routine that ended outrage, where is the document that shows who designed the routine, who approved the language, and what they understood they were truly insulating? By 1976, the story reaches a point that would have sounded impossible in the ash days of 1914. The estate world becomes officially framed as heritage. Kykuit, the controlled environment that sat so calmly in the background while Ludlow burned in public memory, enters the language of preservation. Landmark recognition, stewardship, curated tours, architecture treated as a national cultural object rather than a private fortress. This is not a footnote. It is the final stage of how a reputation becomes operational again. The name does not merely survive, it becomes usable. What remained was not innocence, what remained was function. A legacy can remain intact even when a moral wound remains open, as long as the wound is kept from interfering with institutional life. By the time Kykuit is elevated into a heritage frame, the Rockefeller name has already passed through the post-crisis machinery that turned outrage into procedure, procedure into reform, and reform into distance. The scandal is not erased. It is repositioned. The Present is not defined only by what institutions remember. It is defined by what they preserve. Preservation is a form of power because it decides what the public will physically encounter and what it will encounter only as an argument. Buildings are preserved as experiences. Archives are preserved as curated access. Names are preserved as labels attached to objects that feel permanent. Meanwhile, the moral disorder that made those names radioactive is softened into context, a background note, that does not control the visitor's emotional rhythm. This is how permanence is manufactured across generations. First, the crisis is managed in real time. Then, the record is stabilized in official forums. Then, the abuse is normalized into administrative language. And finally, the legacy is institutionalized as culture. Culture is where reputations become durable because culture teaches people what to admire without forcing them to carry the full weight of what that admiration costs. On October 15, 1976, the custodial layer becomes visible in a modern institutional form. The National Trust for Historic Preservation enters as part of the story's contemporary infrastructure. The action is concrete and official. It is not a private decision whispered among heirs. It is the language of legitimacy applied to a physical site, recognition, preservation framing, the transformation of private architecture into a managed public narrative. In practical terms, this means objects and spaces are protected, interpreted, and presented. The estate becomes something that can be visited, understood, appreciated. It becomes a controlled interface between the public and the legacy. And that interface matters because it shapes memory the way a commission hearing shaped memory in 1915 through selection, sequencing, and tone. A visitor encounters the permanence of stone, curated art, planned vistas, the impression of civilization and order. Even when the narrative acknowledges controversy, the physical environment carries a deeper message. Stability won. The estate exists. It is preserved. It is framed as part of the nation's cultural inheritance. This is not about accusing preservation as a crime. It is about recognizing what preservation does to moral heat. When institutions preserve architecture and objects, they preserve them in a language that makes them safe for public consumption. That language can include complexity, but it rarely allows complexity to dominate the visitor's experience. Moral disorder is treated as a historical dimension, not an active charge. It becomes a chapter, a context, a point of interest, not a demand that interrupts admiration. The consequence is both cultural and operational. Culturally, the Rockefeller name remains functional. It can be placed on plaques, in brochures, in educational framing, in philanthropic histories. It can be associated with stewardship, art, civic contribution. It can be carried forward without requiring the public to live inside Ludlow's moral urgency. Operationally, this matters because functional cultural legitimacy supports everything that legitimacy always supported: partnerships, influence, acceptance, and a general social permission structure that allows elite networks to operate without being constantly relitigated. Meanwhile, Ludlow remains morally radioactive, but less operationally threatening. The event still exists in labor history, in union memory, in moral language that can still wound a name when invoked, but it does not govern the everyday public encounter with the legacy. A person can tour an estate and experience stability as heritage, while the tragedy that once threatened to destabilize that very stability is held at arm's length, translated into historical context rather than moral indictment. This is the final misalignment you can touch with your hands. One site becomes preserved and interpreted as permanence. The other site remains, for most people, a word. The estate is experienced. The tent colony is remembered, if at all, through fragments, partial lists, contested accounts, memorial language that rarely gains equal institutional amplification. The physicality of preservation is not neutral. It tilts memory toward what can be visited and away from what was destroyed. Institutions preserve what can be preserved. But the choice of how to narrate what cannot be preserved is where the moral question lives. A curated narrative can acknowledge that labor conflict was harsh, without allowing the visitor to sit with the fact that families and children died in a camp destroyed by force connected to ownership power. It can refer to industrial unrest, without forcing the visitor to confront how rapidly outrage was processed into reform language designed to protect legitimacy. It can treat Ludlow as one of many historical controversies while treating the estate as a unique cultural artifact. This is why the legacy that remained is not simply a mansion standing. It is a system of custodianship that turns the legacy into a public good. Once a legacy is framed as heritage, critique must compete with the idea of preservation itself. If you criticize too sharply, you can be positioned as attacking history, attacking culture, attacking education. The estate becomes protected not only by law or wealth, but by the moral shield of stewardship. That shield does not erase Ludlow. It simply ensures Ludlow cannot easily interrupt the curated experience of permanence. The story's coldest detail is that this outcome is not a deviation from the earlier pattern. It is the mature form of it. In 1914-1915, the crisis was handled by materials, statements, hearings, and administrative reform. In 1976 and beyond, the legacy is handled by institutions that specialize in making permanence feel natural. The same underlying technique persists, not forging history, but curating what history is allowed to feel like. And the injustice remains alive inside that curation, because the question that should have followed Ludlow is not, how do we preserve stability? The question should have been, what does stability mean when it can be purchased with distance and maintained through managed language? If the public encounter with the legacy is organized around admiration and context, then the moral wound is still present, but it is domesticated. This is what it means for a name to remain culturally functional. It can be associated with beauty, permanence, contribution, and institutional seriousness, while the moral disorder that once threatened to attach itself permanently is contained within categories that do not demand consequence: context, complexity, history. The closing image is concrete and modern, a guided tour pamphlet on a reception table, a plaque bearing the estate's name, a preservation seal that signals official legitimacy, while somewhere else in the country's memory, Ludlow persists as a stain without a comparable institutional doorway. The unresolved tension is immediate and points to what comes next. If heritage framing can preserve a legacy without preserving a moral reckoning, then the final question is not what happened in 1914. It is who, in every era afterward, kept deciding what the public was allowed to carry as history and what it was encouraged to treat as merely context. In January 1931, enough time had passed for the shock to become record. The language had cooled. The names had thinned into categories. The event that once threatened to stain a dynasty had been folded into the nation's administrative memory, indexed, summarized, and made safe for citation. This is how an official story hardens, not by proving itself true, but by becoming the version that institutions can repeat without consequence. The public still remembered Ludlow, but in the way a country remembers a cautionary word, not a living wound. What endured with far greater stability was the posture that followed, The careful conversion of blood into incident, of outrage into reform, of responsibility into procedure. Durable power rarely needs to defeat an accusation in court. It only needs to outlast the loudest weak, refine the vocabulary, and ensure that the surviving documents speak in a tone that feels final. The architecture of that victory is never theatrical. It is made of access and timing. A record is assembled while witnesses are still displaced. A narrative is distributed while the facts are still unsettled. A hearing is staged once the posture has been rehearsed. A committee is formed so that moral disorder can be processed into institutional routine. And then, decades later, a house is preserved, a corridor is lit, a name is framed as heritage, while the original violence is softened into context, kept present enough to appear honest and distant enough to remain harmless. In the end, it is not the fire that decides what history becomes. It is the filing cabinet. It is the phrasing approved for public repetition. It is the quiet authority of those who decide what the public may see and for how long. The tent colony could be burned in a day. The meaning of the burning could be managed for generations. What survived was not merely stone and landscape at Pocantico Hills, but a method, the ability to turn a scandal into a chapter and a chapter into a footnote, until a clean exit felt less like strategy and more like fate. We are left with the same cold question, still unresolved, still waiting in the dim air between rooms. If permanence was preserved so carefully, who chose what had to be forgotten for it to remain intact? For every estate that stands serenely in the present, there is often a set of decisions hidden behind it, sealed doors, restricted archives, documents that speak with deliberate calm. Here, the calm was not an absence of conflict. It was the product of it. If you want to keep reading these halls as they truly function, surface beauty above invisible administration, subscribe to Beyond the Golden Halls so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. And if this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.